I am a one-woman IT show. All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Christina with Atlantic Institute. We welcome you here tonight to our discussion with author and historian Jon Pahl. Before we start our discussion, I'm just going to share a short video on what is Atlantic Institute. And I want to just ask before I start my video, if you guys can make sure that you do mute yourselves. I'm going to share my screen, but I just want to make sure that you get to mute yourself. All right, let's go ahead and share. All right, and we're going to show it from here.
The Atlantic Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting harmonious coexistence between peoples of various cultures, faiths, and backgrounds. We seek this goal through peaceful dialogue, education initiatives, and community organization. Our dialogue events bring together experts, community and faith leaders, and knowledge seekers to address social issues that affect us all. We feel dialogue is the most important element in peaceful coexistence, so we try and maintain several panel discussions, TED Talk events, and book clubs throughout the year. These events touch on social issues, race relations, and cultural understanding and are a mainstay of our programming. The Atlantic Institute's education events are extremely important to our mission of understanding. We want to promote socially forward critical thinking to students of all ages. To that end, we have developed programs that seek to grow the creative spirit of students and help them think about their communities and the world around them. Our Future Leaders of Dialogue event brings together nominated elite students to learn from each other as well as political and business leaders. Our art and essay contest gives students a theme about important societal issues and allows them to create wonderful works of art and writing while steering their minds towards improving their world. We're always seeking ways to educate youths and adults in order to make a peaceful world for all of us. Our community events are designed to transform neighbors into friends and groups of people into a community. By associating with other nonprofits or by our own initiative, we are always trying to discover new avenues to improve our neighborhoods, places of worship, and community centers. We host cooking demonstrations of food from other cultures, work with various nonprofits to help elevate the work of others, and try to find a way to make the lives of those who are disenfranchised or marginalized better. Building a more peaceful world starts in our backyards, so we are dedicated to improving our communities and associations. The Atlantic Institute is always seeking like-minded volunteers and collaborators. If you would like to learn more, find volunteer opportunities, or just want to chat with our staff, please visit our website at www.atlanticinstitutesc.org or follow us on Facebook. We will never run out of fun, educational, peaceful events, so come join us to help make this world a better place full of understanding and unity.
Okay, thank you all for watching. We'll make sure everybody gets to see that and gets to learn a little bit about who we are and what we do. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jon Pahl. He is the author and historian, as well as, I can pull it up real quick. He authored the book on Fathullah Gulen, and he's somebody that a lot of us are familiar with and some of us are not. But he wrote a very insightful book, and he is a historian of religions, a public theologian, a teacher, a pastor, a community activist. He also received his BA from Valparaiso University, MTS from Trinity Lutheran Seminary, and PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He is quite established. He has written quite a few other books, and his book, Fathullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World, is a very thought-provoking book. And we know it's, Akifa said it was very, very well written. So I'd like to turn this evening over to Dr. Pahl for him to share with us and speak. Then we'll have some questions and answers. And just so everybody knows, our goal is to finish by 8:30. So we want to make sure everybody knows what the time frame is. All right, so Dr. Jon Pahl, if you go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Atlantic Institute and Akif for the invitation to be with you tonight. I've been in Greenville once before in my life and have very fond memories of it. One of my dearest college friends, Dr. Gregory S. Holt, who is a gastroenterologist, lives in Greenville. And Greg is a very fine jazz piano player, in addition to being a great doctor. And I play the saxophone, and he and I had a band together in college. So if you happen to know Dr. Gregory S. Holt, tell him JP says hello. So I like to begin talks with a little attempt at humor. My ethnic background is German and Norwegian, two cultures not known for their deep senses of humor, perhaps, but I like knock-knock jokes now, and it's very difficult to do knock-knock jokes in a Zoom forum. So you're just going to have to imagine that we're all together in a room and you're responding to my prompts for these really terrible knock-knock jokes. But okay, so here we go. I have three of them. First one is knock-knock, tank. You're welcome. Get it? Tank who, you know, that kind of thing. All right, there's one. I told you they're bad. All right, and number two, knock knock, ach, Gesundheit.
Two, yes, that's funny.
Two, yes, no, that's terrible. All right, and one more, and then I'll get serious, which is my normal mode. Knock knock.
I'll play and say, who's there?
Olive.
Olive who?
I love you too.
Well, thank you.
And that's what's known as a transition, because the authentic Fathullah Gulen is all about love. He is very much a teacher and preacher and scholar in the tradition of Rumi, Mevlana, that is out of the Sufi tradition of Islam. And the very first lines of Mr. Gulen's most accessible book in English, which is entitled Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. Once again, toward a global civilization of love and tolerance. The very first lines of that book are as follows. Love is the most essential element of every being. Love is the most radiant light. Love is the greatest power, able to resist and overcome all else. That is the authentic Fathullah Gulen, who I discovered in my 10 years of research about his life. 10 years that included going to Turkey and studying Turkish. If you want to see how that went, you can look up the essay I wrote about it entitled The Güzel Ama Zor Turkish Language, which means the beautiful but difficult Turkish language, and traveling to the sites where Mr. Gulen was born, a tiny little village, Korajuk, near Erzurum in northeastern Turkey, and then to Edirne in Thrace, so in the very far northwest, where he was first appointed to a tiny little mosque as a preacher, and then to Izmir, where he said as a small provincial backwoods boy, he said going to this cosmopolitan city, the biblical city of Smyrna, of course, is my favorite city in Turkey, although Istanbul is pretty incredible too. But anyway, when he was sent to Izmir as a young man in his 20s, he said, I am going to drown there. And in fact, he flourished. And it was in Izmir where students in particular and young people were drawn to his teachings, which surfaced authentic Islam. So we have tonight the authentic Fathullah Gulen and the authentic Islam as practiced by people of Hizmet. So that's what I'll be speaking about with you. So from Izmir, then throughout the Aegean, his reputation grew, and people were drawn to him, flocking to hear him preach. and eventually then to Istanbul as well. So the book follows his life chronologically and geographically. And then, of course, in 1999, Mr. Gulen came to the United States for health reasons. His doctor was here. He is diabetic and has some cardiac issues, but also to escape the political circumstances in Turkey at the time. My book, Fathullah Gulen, here it is, I'll do the commercial thing, A Life of Hizmet, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World, is organized, as I said, chronologically, but also organized topically to lift up the central teachings of Mr. Gulen's life. And so chronologically, it follows him from his birth in 1938 in Korajuk, and then his instruction in Islamic schools, especially in Erzurum. And one of the things that Mr. Gulen said or discovered fairly early on, his formal schooling and education in the public schools in Turkey only lasted until second grade. Thank you, Akif, for posting the link to the book in the chat there. One of the things he said is that he realized very early on that the purely Islamic education that he was receiving was insufficient, that it did not convey or communicate the depth of the Islamic tradition that also incorporated scientific understanding. And so the metaphor that Mr. Gulen developed and that I traced through chapter 1 of the book, which is entitled Learning, the metaphor that he has developed and taught is that a person should fly with two wings. And what he means by that is that faith alone, without science, produces fanaticism and superstition. Science alone, without faith, produces a destructive materialism. And so we need the depths of truth found in faith, and especially the nonviolent and ethical practices, along with the fact-based empirical truth associated with science. And that combination of flying with two wings, holding together spirituality and science, has become the central core of Hizmet wherever it has been planted around the globe, through the individuals who go on to study genetics and medicine and biology and communications and sociology and history, and through the schools that are founded wherever people of Hizmet are identified in land. So the first schools began, of course, in Turkey, in the Izmir region, but very quickly caught on because of this emphasis on flying with two wings, holding together spirituality and science, spread all over Turkey and now all over the world in 130 different countries at one point. Unfortunately now, of course, because of the repression of the dictatorial regime in Turkey, many of those schools have been closed. All of them have been closed in Turkey or taken over by people associated with the current dictatorial regime in a kleptocratic power grab that took billions of dollars in assets away from people who had worked to build those institutions. And it's not just schools, it's also the tutoring centers, universities, newspapers, TV stations, all kinds of corporations. I'll say more about that shortly. So learning, flying with two wings, the first and perhaps most important theme in the life of Fathullah Gulen. Chapter 2 is entitled We Were Young, and focuses on his years in Izmir and how especially it was students and young people who were drawn to his teachings of nonviolence. In the 1960s and 70s, Turkey was roiled by political conflict between leftists and rightists, communists and nationalists, with Islamists also thrown into the mix, although Islam had been, pretty strictly pushed down by the officially secularist Turkish government, or controlled by the state would be a better way to put it. But Mr. Gulen began teaching a different, kind of a third way of Islam, not state Islam, not political Islam, but what I call in the book civil Islam, focused on cultivating individuals of integrity and cultivating the authentic nonviolent practices at the heart of Islam. And so chapter 2, We Were Young, focuses on his teaching during these years and then down throughout his life of the pillars of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam, all of which at their core are nonviolent affirmations and practices. So to take prayer for an example, prayer has been studied recently by neuroscientists and social scientists. We're a little slower, social scientists, to begin to investigate this. But what prayer does is focuses the front parts of our brain, that is, the parts of our brain designed to attend and that are responsible for empathy, as opposed to the lizard brain, which is our fight-flight response. So in prayer, we learn sociability. In prayer, we learn empathy. In prayer, we learn nonviolence. And Mr. Gulen consistently has taught that all of the 5 pillars of Islam are practices of nonviolence, practices of sociability, practices to build community between Muslims and eventually between people of all faiths or no faith insofar as possible. But these nonviolent practices were really at the heart, following the educational initiatives of Mr. Gulen's teachings through sohbets, through small group meetings, where people would get together and pray and discuss and talk with one another in community. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 then focuses on Mr. Gulen's years around the Aegean as his reputation began to spread. And the title is Empathy and Tears. One of the distinctive things about Mr. Gulen's life and preaching is that when he would preach, he would often cry. And initially, when I began discovering this, it struck me as a very odd thing. And it made me wonder, well, as a historian of religions, what's going on here? You know, is this emotional response? Is it manipulation? What's happening here? And so I asked people, I did, about 60 interviews with people both inspired by Mr. Gulen and people critical of Mr. Gulen. And the people who were most inspired by his teaching said that what his tears represented was the sadness that he felt about the status of Muslims around the globe. In other words, he was identifying with the suffering of his sisters and brothers, and then beyond that, the suffering of others around the globe in this warfare between science and religion. And so he would sob often in his preaching. And what's interesting is that the entire congregation would then begin sobbing along with him. Now, it was the Buddha who taught that life is suffering. And so what Mr. Gulen was communicating through his teaching and through his tears was this identification with the first noble truth, that life is suffering. But empathy alone is not enough to inspire a global movement like Mr. Gulen in fact did. And so along with his tears came also practical action. That is, recommendations for practical action to develop civil Islam, to develop a stronger civil society based on the trust that circulated between people in these small groups and who were gaining education in the schools and who were beginning to build other kinds of institutions as well. So I call this engaged empathy, much in the same way that many Buddhists have recently developed engaged Buddhism. You see the same kind of intention on the part of Mr. Gulen in his life and teaching and on the part of people inspired by him in Hizmet as well. Chapter 4 then focuses on his years in Istanbul between 1980 and 1999. The first 6 of those years, he was on the run. Each of the chapters in the book ends with a military coup. So throughout Mr. Gulen's life, he has repeatedly been targeted and harassed by the Turkish government. Initially, of course, by the secularist regime, now by an Islamist regime. And this shows us how Mr. Gulen is kind of carving a third way. Unfortunately, he gets it then for both sides. But this chapter is entitled Melancholy and Dialogue, and it focuses especially on the emergence of the dialogue activities inspired by Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet. One of the first ones, a big event, was held in 1995 at the Renaissance Polat Hotel on the Sea of Marmara in Istanbul. I was fortunate to be able to stay there once, in part because I knew that's where this event had been held. There was over 1,000 people there. And some of the journalists who were there said this was the most inclusive gathering that had ever been held in Turkish society, bringing together leftists and rightists, Islamists and secularists, all gathered together under one umbrella, one key term that is central to Mr. Gulen's teaching and life. In Turkish, the term is hoşgörü, right? Usually gets translated as tolerance, as in toward a global civilization of love and tolerance. But Scott Alexander, who is a professor of Islamic studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, Catholic Theological Seminary. Anyway, Professor Scott Alexander, I heard give a talk in Accra, Ghana, where I was also a speaker. And in Accra, it was the first time that Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of indigenous religions had been together to focus on peace. And Scott's talk was about hoşgörü, the term and the practice. And what Scott said is that the word is, as anyone who knows Turkish will understand, it's a compound word. Hoşgörü, to see nicely, is a literal translation of it. So you can see how that might be translated as tolerance. But Scott said to just translate it on that level, literally, is to really miss the depth of it. And tolerance isn't a very good translation either, because tolerance, is kind of a weak virtue. I'm going to tolerate you, I'm going to put up with you. No, that's not what hoşgörü is all about. Scott said we have to understand it theologically, because of course Mr. Gulen is a theologian, a profound theologian, schooled in the many different varieties of kalam, of scholarship. Yes, thank you, Akif, for posting the term hoşgörü. There it is on the chat screen, without the Turkish letters, but that's okay. You heard me pronounce it more or less accurately. But Scott says to understand hoşgörü theologically, what it means is to see another as God sees them. And what that means is to see another essentially with eyes of mercy and compassion. Bismillah, al-Rahman, al-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, Muslims pray. And it's that attitude and that approach to others that Mr. Gulen fostered in community through dialogue events, through think tanks like the Atlantic Institute, and through events just like this one that continue to take place all over the world, right? In order to promote this idea of hoşgörü. In practice, what hoşgörü means is dialogue. It means getting together, finding ways to work together across our differences, despite our differences, putting into practice what the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs called the dignity of difference, recognizing that we are stronger, right? When we are woven together from different strands then when we're all made of the same fabric. All right, so that's chapter 4. One more chapter in the book, and then I'm going to read you just a couple passages, or just one passage from it. So chapter 5 then is Hizmet Global, 1999 to the present. And in this chapter, it traces the global expansion of Hizmet as a community. I think that's the best description or name for the people who have been inspired by Mr. Gulen. Often it gets described as a movement, but that's really too hierarchical, because this is, anybody who's been connected with Hizmet events knows there's not that much organizational structure. It's really grassroots and a community more than a movement in many ways. But Hizmet, as Mr. Gulen came to the United States, expanded especially through the Soviet republics, initially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now all over the globe, putting into practice 3 essential things. Mr. Gulen, following the teachings of Said Nursi, a mid-20th century Turkish reformer, just a generation before Mr. Gulen. Nursi said there are 3 problems facing the modern world: ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence. Mr. Gulen, deeply informed by Nursi's teachings, followed this and said, okay, well, what's the solution to ignorance? The solution to ignorance is education. Poverty, what's the solution to poverty? Well, Mr. Gulen said, wealth generation, in the form of wealth generation that serves the common good. And I'll say more about that shortly. And then the solution to disunity or violence is obviously the practice of nonviolence and peace building. So I treat Mr. Gulen as a peace builder, especially in these last years as he became more globally aware by living in the United States, and as the movement globalized as well. So the title of the chapter is Hizmet Global. And really what it focuses on is the practice of istishara, mutual consultation. It is this practice that builds the different institutions and organizations that are the expression of the kind of civil Islam that Mr. Gulen fostered. And istishara then manifested itself in all kinds of agencies and institutions, especially in an organization called Kimse Yakmulu, which is a relief organization begun in Turkey following a devastating earthquake, and then present in relief events all over the globe, and continues down to today in various manifestations wherever the Turkish government hasn't been able to squash it around the globe. But the chapter also documents the struggles of people of Hizmet with the Turkish government, especially the recent struggles, all of which I trace to the corruption inquiries that came very close to the family and the current dictator of Turkey, that then were shut down and blamed on Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet. So this is 2013, well before the so-called coup event on July 15th of 2016. So well before that, already the scapegoating of Hizmet had begun. And Mr. Gulen is living in a retreat center, a summer camp in Pennsylvania. And the idea that he is somehow masterminding, I mean, he doesn't have a computer, masterminding all of these events in Turkey, somehow, it's ludicrous. And so what is developed in Turkey is this pattern of scapegoating Gulen and Hizmet in order to hold together the kleptocratic power following the Putin model in Turkish politics. Mr. Gulen is a perfect scapegoat to unite both the secularist left, who've never liked Gulen and Islam, and the political Islamists like Erdogan. These two very distinct factions have united in their scapegoating of Gulen in a way that has had tragic consequences in human rights violations in Turkey and around the globe as well. And so that last chapter in the book takes up those matters and clarifies, again, Mr. Gulen's central principles of nonviolence and his practice of istishara, mutual consultation, and mushbet harakat, positive action, very much like Gandhian nonviolence, which is the central principle of which is, do not react to evil. But practice instead satyagraha, truth, force. Mr. Gulen said mushbet harakat, positive action. And so here's how I conclude the book, and this will be the end of my remarks. And I look forward to our conversation and Q&A. And I apologize, I've gone a little longer than 15 to 20 minutes, but I hope that's okay. So these are the last pages of the book, the very end. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of Mr. Gulen's biography. And by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, as Mr. Gulen had written in a poem from America, eyes again on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation. And now this is a long quote from Gulen. Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. This springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, and human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. Travelers on the way to God, those devotees of love who have no time for hostility, will carry their inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. Now, my concluding 2 paragraphs. In a winter of brutal strongmen, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian, no more than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing that Fathullah Gulen really knew how to do, it was to pray. So when he also encouraged people that, quote, difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been tested in Fathullah Gulen's life and proven true almost from its beginning. Concluding paragraph. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gulen's dream for a golden generation, and there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korajuk was now a frail old man. And yet Fathullah Gulen's life was never about a short-term horizon to be measured by a brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven. He believed in resurrection. He believed in justice. These beliefs were not tied only to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gulen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They also were convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the arc in that direction. As Gulen put it often in many publications, power resides in truth. Any power otherwise founded was destined to fail. And so the end of Fathullah Gulen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fathullah Gulen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile, whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you so much for being here tonight, for listening to my words, and for caring about Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet around the globe. And I look forward to our questions and conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, I'm sorry, John. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is my second time that I'm listening to you about your book. In fact, the first time I didn't have your book, and I just kind of part of your presentation. And after that, I had, in fact, you signed your book, and then I got your book and I read it. Thank you so much. So, in fact, this is one of the greatest books that I have ever read about the Hizmet, even though I'm kind of part of the Hizmet movement from my very early age. But this is a great work. I really appreciate for your scholarly, objective reflections through the book. I definitely encourage everyone that I share the link with the chat, and if you have chance to really get the book and read it, it's very, very, very impressive. Definitely. So I would like to ask a question because I have almost many highlights on the just underlining many sentences over here. So you kind of call the Hizmet, the movement, in a very right way, that the way that Mr. Gulen contributed to the peace of building by patient and proactive work. That is the two things that the methodology or the promotion that he had the peace building. And the second thing that you tell, it was the way that spiritual power, because Gulen was an imam, right? And in the West, unfortunately, most of the time when we hear about imam, it is not a positive image. So now you have an imam like a pastor, and that now in your book, you tell that he, in fact, points to the way spiritual power translates into practical action, into peace building through discernible and consistent practices. So I really appreciate if you can articulate a little bit about what you mean with this.
Of course, thank you, Akif, very much for your excellent questions. So what I describe in the book is what I call deep peace being generated by Mr. Gulen and people at Hizmet. And to clarify what that means, we have to understand sort of what the opposite of that is, and that would be the violence that is unfortunately so pandemic in our cultures and societies. So violence has many layers. It starts with, and I often describe it as an iceberg. Violence is like an iceberg. At the top would be illegitimate physical violence, murder, rape, vandalism, right? But underneath that, we legitimate all kinds of violence, harm to or destruction of life, in order to control the violence, the illegitimate physical violence. But underneath that, even more, is economic and social violence, the inequalities in access to education and healthcare, basic human rights. All of these are also kinds of violence. And then finally, the very last, the lowest, the deepest layer of the violence iceberg is what I call cultural violence, the way our language produces harm, us versus them dynamics especially, so dualisms and enemy creation. And so Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet work to address the violence iceberg through what I call the alternative, the peace building garden, through the seeds of peace that are learning, engaged empathy, nonviolent practices, principled pluralism, and mutual consultation or social enterprises, as I call them, beyond socialism and capitalism, or a principled capitalism, maybe would be another way to put it. And so what Mr. Gulen has done as a peace builder would be sort of in the soil of producing peace. If peace is like a garden, you know, the capacities to flourish, that's all peace is. Nothing romantic or utopian about it. It's simply that capacity to flourish, and then the social systems and structures and practices to put that into place. Mr. Gulen has been working with individuals and communities then have been building among themselves this kind of deep peace in the very soil of the peace building garden. It's very much like other religiously and spiritually engaged peace builders around the globe. So the book I will be working on next is entitled A Coming Religious Peace, and it focuses on the emergence of religious peace building around the globe, basically from Gandhi to Lima Bowie, a Liberian Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2011, and others who've recognized that our traditions all exist. That is, our spiritual traditions exist to promote peace, peace within and peace without. They are the single most important barriers to peace, unfortunately, when they get politicized and misused. So they exist to promote peace, but when they're perverted, they generate violence. And so Mr. Gulen has been working at that level at the roots of violence, trying to overcome these us versus them dualisms. And it's precisely because he's working at that root level, that radical level of peace building, that he's been such a target for the Turkish government, which of course is built now, unfortunately, on a facade of democracy and authoritarian politics. So this deep peace is really one of the key contributions that Mr. Gulen has brought, not only within Islam, which of course means peace, but as a contributor to interreligious dialogue as well, where we can recognize our capacity to work together in creative and in practical ways, very practical ways, you know, communications, newspapers, etc. Of course, political life too. But to characterize Mr. Gulen politically is to mischaracterize him. Politics is always penultimate. He's never endorsed a candidate. He's never endorsed a party. He's always focused instead on cultivating peace within, and then peace within families, and then peace within small communities, peace islands, and then, you know, inshallah, peace between peoples around the globe as well. All right, I hope, Akif, that is a helpful response to your initial question.
Yes, it was great.
That's good.
Thank you.
And I noticed my friend, a colleague, and former student, Matthew Hunter, has responded with a question. This is a very, very pleasant surprise. That's amazing. He was a student of mine at Temple. Go ahead.
Very cool. I'm going to read his question to you. He had to leave at 8, but I'll let him know that we will ask it, and then he can play back a recording and he can listen. So he said, great to see you again. I just got back from a short trip to Western Turkey. I really wanted to ask about Gulen when I was there, but didn't want to put anyone in an awkward position. I'm curious about the state of those in Turkey who were drawn to Gulen's teaching and saw their institutions dismantled. Is the Hizmet movement underground there? I really enjoyed listening to this conversation. Now he's going to get the book and look for some podcasts about this. And he was saying he had to go. He told his son that they would do something together at 8. And he's curious if you've done any podcast interviews too. And if not, you have a friend that can help you. I'm
Well, that's
summarizing just so
wonderful.
that the whole point's across.
Yeah, and you can. I hope Matt will look me up again. It's been a couple of years since we've talked. He wrote a really fine dissertation at Temple. So this is from Dr. Matthew Hunter. His question is an excellent one about the status of people of Hizmet who were drawn to Gulen's teachings and saw their institutions dismantled. Of course, there are people inspired by him, more or less, who remain in Turkey. But the depth of the repression following the so-called coup event of July 15th is pretty astonishing. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people arrested, imprisoned, or who've had to flee the country as refugees. And it's truly been a brain drain within Turkey. It's tragic.
Yes, and I can see that too. I was there in 2014, and I just know the hospitals that I toured and the institutions, the colleges that I toured, and the dorms that we stayed in, and all that stuff. And to imagine the vastness of that dawn, really, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge, again, kleptocratic transfer of assets, and yet, you know, this has happened before in the history of Hizmet. So Mr. Gulen was persecuted. I mentioned, you know, he had to go on the run for 6 years while the government was, you know, seeking him, more or less. It was kind of a weird political theater. But what was interesting is that during those 6 years, while Mr. Gulen had to be very on the down low, he was traveling to different places around Turkey. And so Hizmet grew during those 6 years. And again, kind of discovered its essence, its heart, right, over and against the political repression. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict, you know, what's going to happen in the future. I'm a historian, not a futurologist, and even futurologists probably don't get much right. Actually, if you went back and studied what they imagined. But there's a pattern here that has played itself out over time before, namely, as Hizmet faces repression, it moves out and spreads, and then, you know, roots itself in new ways and continues to expand, because finally the power of the movement is love. The power of the community is love, and love never dies. That's 1 Corinthians. So one example of kind of how this is playing itself out. Before COVID, I did a little tour, and I would love to come to Greenville someday to meet with you all face to face. I really would, and I could search my friend down. I'd bring my saxophone along, and we'd offer a little Duke Ellington or something for you if we had a dinner. Honestly, I would love to do
wonderful.
That would be so much fun. But one of the places I visited and spoke was Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where some people inspired by Mr. Gulen have gone. They were there since the late 1990s, but, you know, a number of folks have landed there since the recent unpleasantness in Turkey as well. And so, you know, I did a talk like this one at a beautiful hotel in downtown Dar es Salaam. I don't know, about 300 people there or so, you know, representing all varieties of Tanzanian society. And then afterwards, they said, okay, well, we'd like to take you to dinner, and we'd like to go to the headquarters of our relief agency. And I thought, okay, sure, great. Yeah, sounds good. Free food. I'm all for that. So we drove from the hotel in downtown Dar es Salaam out to the headquarters of the relief agency, which was located on the ocean. And they had a beautiful table set up, you know, basically a feast. It was extraordinary, the meal that we had as the waves were crashing, you know, on the shore behind us as dust fell. And I was as usual, after dinner, they said, okay, could you say a few words? And I said, of course, I'd be happy to. So I talked a little more, but I wanted to hear who was with me, who was gathered around this table. Representing this, I learned, this was the board of directors of the Tanzanian Relief Agency, inspired by people of Hizmet. And there were about 25, 26 of us or so. And there were 4 Turks and 22 Tanzanians. And that sort of indigenization, or that taking root in a culture, is the genius of this service community. And these were folks, bankers, engineers, scholars, representing all construction workers, all angles and cohorts in Tanzanian society. And it seems to me this is what's happening around the globe now, as people of Hizmet have been forced in many ways to flee Turkey. They're landing and working as Uber drivers or whatever, wherever they are, until they can get settled. And then the educational initiatives, the social enterprises, the dialogue activities are taking root in new and astonishing ways that I think will continue to flourish, inshallah, God willing. And you can tell Matt I'd be happy to do a podcast. He can, you can Google my name and Fathullah Gulen, and he'll find all kinds of videos out there, including eventually this one.
Okay, good to know. I appreciate you saying that this, the way of being, I would say, takes root in the other cultures. You were making me think of the 3 of us employees, so to speak, here in South Carolina. None of us are Turkish, and we did not, we fell into what we were doing. And for me, it's who I am, who I was as a kind, giving person, and it's been allowed to be exemplified and amplified, because it's who we are. We have people here. My significant other is a mechanic, and he has customers come up, and some of them are very needy and poor, and we will give them some meat from the freezer to take home, and we take care of whoever comes our way, and it's kind of like working here for like 8 years. It's like Akif has given us the space to say, we don't ever turn anybody away from an event. We had a dinner one time, and I didn't eat. And like 4 of us didn't eat. We sat in the back, and we gave everybody else our chairs and our seats. And it was just whoever came in, we made room. We said, we don't really matter. What really matters is the people that are coming to learn about the dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that spirit of altruism is crucial. One of the other talks that I've often done is about the different kinds of altruism that are found in Hizmet and that Mr. Gulen has inspired. For sure, that sort of other-centeredness is very much at the heart of Islam. In fact, it's even the way Mr. Gulen describes jihad, right? Mm-hmm. So, this phrase that gets used a lot, not so much lately because, there are unfortunately other enemies that have been identified by folks, but Islamophobia is still deep. And so the circulation of the language of jihad and jihadi, is a big scare word. And what Mr. Gulen teaches, very much in keeping with Orthodox Islam, the heart of Islam, and its Sufi dimensions in particular, is that there are 2 kinds of jihad. There's the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The lesser jihad is defensive military action. That is to protect yourself, your country, your people from attack. But the greater jihad, the greater struggle, is with the ego, is to overcome the ego, to let go of that attachment to actions and the results of actions, and instead to act in a way that seeks God's pleasure, seeks the pleasure of the other, even seeks the flourishing of the other before one's own. And it seems to me that's very much enacted in the kind of activities that Hizmet has inspired around the globe. And again, it's part of what has made folks vulnerable to ruthless tyrants.
Yes.
Would be that that attitude of gratitude.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's another question or a couple more.
No, I think we have maybe a child and asking something in here. Does anybody have a? Not quite sure how to decipher
That's
that.
all right. Well, if there are no others.
Here I can see. Keith, do you have something else to add?
Yeah, I can. I really want to ask another question, if you don't mind. As a Christian and as a scholar, historian, why did you write this book?
Well, I had started writing the book, A Coming Religious Peace. The book I published in 2012 that I'd worked on for about 6 years before that was entitled Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence. And it was a study of, where violence came from in American culture and how religion was implicated in it, especially the civil religion, or what you might call nationalism, kind of merged with Christianity in this, what I call an empire of sacrifice. It was not a pleasant book to write. So I was looking for a happier topic, to be completely honest. And I turned to the flip side, to religious peace building. And then I had been invited to a Hizmet event, iftar dinner. I tell this story at the beginning of the book in 2007, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into at all. I had no idea who Gulen was, never heard of the Hizmet movement before, and this was when we were living in Philadelphia. It was an event at the Sheraton Hotel, and it was sponsored by Dialogue Forum, and I didn't know what I was getting into at all. But the keynote speaker that night was Father Thomas Michel. And he was a really terrible speaker, actually, because he read to us the entire time from this book. He just read us passages from Gulen's Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. But once I got over my judgy, this is a terrible speech, I started listening to what he was saying and listening to the passage from Gulen, and I said, wow, this is really good. I mean, this is peace building. This is central insights. And so I bought a copy of the book and started reading it. And the next day, I wrote an editorial for the Philadelphia Inquirer talking about the hospitality I'd experienced and saying a little bit about who Gulen was. And that was the beginning of it, Keith, that in 2007. And then in 2008, I gave a talk about Gulen as a peace builder at a conference that was organized in Georgetown. 2010, there was a conference at the University of Chicago. I spoke there, and it was there that the idea for the biography really originated in a conversation with the individual who was the director of the Gulen Institute in Houston. The following year, I went to Turkey to study Turkish, and unfortunately, the book languished a little bit. I didn't get as much research done as quickly as I would have liked. I wish the book would have been out before 2013, but there's our time schedule and then there's God's time schedule. And so after the coup, I realized this book really needs to get done. So I was able to dedicate myself pretty much full time to writing it, courtesy of a sabbatical at the seminary and courtesy of a little fellowship from the Alliance for Shared Values, and so that allowed me to get it done and to get it out. But I wrote it to represent initially the potential of our religious traditions to produce peace. So I was writing about peace building, gradually focused on Gulen, and then this opportunity arose, and then of course it went bad in Turkey. And I realized there was even a stronger urgency for me to get the book completed and get it done. And that gave it both its edge and its, I think, significance as well. So I hope it's a good read. I hope it's faithful to Mr. Gulen's thinking and teaching. And I hope it's also an objective reporting of who the man is in his life and the movement he's inspired. I really tried to put into practice the maxim from Martin Luther's interpretation of the Eighth Commandment. The Eighth Commandment being, of course, you shall not bear false witness. And Luther responds to that by saying, what does this mean? Thou shalt not bear false witness. That we should not belie, betray, or slander our neighbor, but speak well of them, lift them up, and put the best construction on everything. So what I tried to do is to overcome the slanders, not to allow the slanders to stand about Mr. Gulen, but then also put the best construction on his life. I would think anyone who, if you're writing about another person's life, right, it's an impossible task, really. How can you possibly summarize the complexity of any individual life? So I really wanted to be fair and be critical, but constructively critical in the book, based on the evidence, objectively, as a Christian, as an avowed, Christian theologian and public scholar. And, I've been serving as a pastor for the last 3 years here in Wisconsin as well. So all of those kind of came together in this book.
Thank you so much for sharing this very insightful information about your journey to this book.
You're welcome, Akif. Are there any other? Oh, yeah. Okay. I see from Jean to me, and then MB Ulmer and Luana as well. Okay. Hold on. Go ahead, Ulmer and Luana. I can see the other question from Jean. So go ahead, Ulmer and Luana.
Yes, Dr. Pahl. Last night, we had a Zoom session with members of our church discussing the power of the Black church in the movement for racial justice. And it almost seems like there's a 50% overlap in what we talked about last night and what we were talking about tonight. I'm struck by the parallel that you have described with the racial justice movement in the United States and beyond. But in the racial justice movement, I can name you many names of leaders. Of course, Martin Luther King is an important leader, but also we know of John Lewis, and we know of Ralph Abernathy and from Greenville. I'm on medication, Jackson. I'm sorry. Jesse Jackson, yes. And
it's all right.
But in the Hizmet movement, I can name Gulen. I know that when we went to Turkey, we were supported by Jihad, letters that mean something that I cannot remember, but a group of businessmen who hosted us while we were there. In the United States, the Hizmet movement, in my mind, has no upper tier leadership like that. We have our own Akif Aden, who does wonderful work, and our
just servants, not leaders,
who do wonderful work. But there are no leaders who are in the forefront of public recognition. Is that my lack of recognition, or do they not exist?
No, they very much exist, Ulmer, and I refer to some of them in the book, both men and women. Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting dynamic here as well. I was asked in Tanzania again, well, what's going to happen when Fathullah Gulen dies? Who's the next Fathullah Gulen?
Be careful. That's what happened. It split the Sunni and the Shia. Sunni and that's right, the Shia.
Yeah. Succession is always tricky, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, who knows? But there are individuals who are recognized for their devotion, for their teaching, and for their scholarship all over the globe, in fact. And it'll be fascinating to see. There may be splits that happen. I hope not. But I was asked in Tanzania who the next Fathullah Gulen was, and I said, well, it might very well be a Tanzanian woman. And that's not entirely facetious. because there's some extraordinary female leadership that has been developed within Hizmet. Gulen himself, I think, has been way out front of Turkish society, and which is pretty ruthlessly patriarchal. And women of Hizmet have been very active, kind of behind the scenes, and in ways that nevertheless engage scholarship and engage teaching as journalists. One of the people I interviewed in the book is Sevgi Akar-Cheshme. She's now married and so has a different last name. But she was the last editor-in-chief of today's Zaman, the English language newspaper. So there's a whole nother generation emerging that I think will blow away a lot of the stereotypes about the kind of centralized power associated with Islam. I think there are many leaders, and I pray that the spirit of cooperation and collaboration will endure. While the analogy with the civil rights movement is very apt. That's a really great insight. And I've one of the dissertations I directed a couple of years ago was by an African American woman, and it was about the women of the civil rights movement as well, who are beginning to get recognized. If you watch the recent series by Henry Louis Gates on the Black Church, he did a pretty good job of lifting up some of those women leaders, although he could have done a little better. Even, I mean, Oprah got a little too much press from my perspective or point of view. But anyway, that's a very good analogy. And as you, I'm sure, are well aware, SCLC and SNCC, sort of develop different paths. But as I said, love never dies. And I think that's the central bottom line here, is that whoever the spokesperson is, whoever the teacher is, whoever the sheikh is, the teaching from back to Rumi, back to Jesus, back to the Buddha, around the globe, we're discovering this commonality on the reality of the power of love. And we just have to have eyes to see it, ears to hear it, and voices to articulate it clearly around the globe. All right, we have 4 minutes left. I see one more question. The status of Hizmet in the U.S. is
also I did get a question asked to me as well. Was just how were you introduced to Hizmet? So you might be able to meld those two together.
Yeah, I mean, I was introduced through the dialogue forum iftar dinner. I wasn't really sure what an iftar was, to be completely honest. I mean, it's embarrassing to admit. I'd studied, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam at the University of Chicago as a historian of religions, but I'd never been to an iftar. And so that was the event that introduced me. And then in 2007, we were invited to take a trip to Turkey. Like many of you, I trust. My wife and I actually celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary in Istanbul, which was really a lovely memory and a great trip, very eye-opening. They gave us a number of books to read on the way over, and that on the flight over, that's what I read, and on the flight home, that's what I read. So that was in many ways my sort of scholarly introduction and practical introduction to Hizmet as well, was the iftar dinner and then the trip to Turkey. And this whole process has changed my life so dramatically for the better. I've gained so many friends, insights. It almost moves me to tears to realize, right, the beauty of the friendships and interactions that I've been privileged to be a part of over the last 10 years. So regarding the status of Hizmet in the US, I pray for its flourishing. I was fortunate to be able to, as I mentioned, tour before COVID broke, October and November of 2019. I was in, I think, 25 different cities, 8 in Canada, 17 mostly on the coasts, but a few interior as well. And one of the last places I stopped was in Houston. And You know, what I learned there was that 10 years ago, there were like 16 businesses associated with Hizmet. Now there were like 150. So the potential is there. These are people of talent who work incredibly hard, who will work with anyone, do anything for service to humanity. So any community where Hizmet lands will be fortunate to have them. Maybe that's a good place to wrap.
Yes, I think so. I just wanted to make sure I had myself unmute. Thank you very much. We
Thank you.
appreciate it. I was going to say if everybody would like to unmute themselves, they can, and they could thank the speaker. Because I know if we were all in person, we would probably do that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your Hizmet as well, and for your contributions to a stronger civil society.
Yes.
And I pray that someday I can be with you in Greenville in person.
And bring your saxophone.
Inshallah, I'll be happy to do that. You won't have to ask me twice.
Yes, we would love to do that. We would love to have you.
Good
Thank
night.
you very much. Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Yep, you too.